Okay, so the 2025 NFL Draft has come and gone, and today I was fortunate enough to be able to attend a seat at the table featuring Bills General Manager Brandon Beane, Assistant GM Brian Gaine, and Director of Player Personnel Terrance Gray. Now, this is an event for the club season ticket holders. I am not a club season ticket holder, but luckily I know people who are, and this is a great event put on by the Bills where you can go ask the front office questions about the draft or just the offseason in general. So before we get into what Bean had to say about the draft and then what I have to say about it and my final analysis and takeaways, let's take a look at the 2025 Buffalo Bills draft class. So the Bills went into this draft with 10 selections and they came out with 9 new players thanks to a couple of trades with the Chicago Bears, which I'll be getting to shortly. And 6 out of those 9 selections came on the defensive side of the ball. So I think that was definitely the point of emphasis for Bean and the staff because they said, you know what? We are tired of giving up 30 plus points to Kansas City. We cannot come up with that big stop in the playoffs. I need to make this a point of emphasis. We're going to build through the trenches and we're going to properly build our defense like Philadelphia did. And that was what led to them being so dominant in the Super Bowl against Kansas City because they laid out the blueprint. They showed that it can be done and that Mahomes is not invincible. So I think they definitely needed to revamp this defense. I love that they built through the line. My only 2 problems that I have is that they didn't draft a wide receiver until round 7. And really, their first 5 selections were defensive players. So it seemed like Beane was neglecting the offensive side of the ball. And then you look, it's a 5th round tight end, and he's mainly a blocking tight end. And then there's another offensive tackle. It really wasn't a position of need. And then they go with Prather out of Maryland in the 7th round. So that would be my main stipulation here is that he didn't do more to give Josh a weapon, right? That was my big thing. I wanted that speedster. I wanted a vertical deep threat who could take the top off the defense in order to make the offense more balanced. Because I think they did a great job of making the defense more balanced. I just hope that they're not neglecting the wide receiver room. But at the same time, maybe we shouldn't be as surprised that he didn't draft a wide receiver earlier because a reminder that he has never drafted a wide receiver in the first round in his 8 years drafting as a Buffalo Bills general manager. Yeah, the last time the Bills actually drafted a wide receiver in the first round was 2014 when they traded up for Sammy Watkins. Not to mention, Keon Coleman is the only wide receiver that Beane has drafted before round 4. So I get it. The Bills needed to retool their defense. They needed to revamp the defense. But at the same time, it would be nice to get on the wide receiver train every now and again. My other big problem that I had was that Shawn Dolac was not the selection at 240 because I saw some people on Twitter saying, if you take a wide receiver now, it kind of feels like a slap in the face. So I thought that would have been a perfect way to finish out the draft. You keep Shawn Dolac home in Buffalo. He was the nation's leading tackler. He also led the nation with 19 tackles for a loss, and he's just all over the field, a great athlete. I thought that would have been a perfect selection at 240, but unfortunately, he signed with the Rams as a UDFA shortly after the draft. Now, in terms of the players who Beane actually selected, starting with Maxwell Haristston. So he ended up staying put at pick number 30, and that's where Haristston was drafted. But I wasn't sure if the Bills were going to trade up, if Beane was going to get antsy, or if he was going to do what he did last year and trade back and go into round 2. Now, we learned today at the town hall that he said if Haristston wasn't available at 30, then they probably would have traded down into round 2. So that tells you that Trey Amos wasn't a first round grade for them, and neither was Will Johnson with his medical concerns. So when Haristston was selected, I was a little bit surprised, not going to lie, because I just figured that the Bills would want a bigger, more physical corner, because when you see his weight there of being 183 pounds, you're like, I don't know about that, because we know how important the defensive backs are in Sean McDermott's defense. Now, it did come out, Beane, and I think Haristston said this too, that he's up to 192 pounds now. So he is putting more weight on, but that was one of the biggest knocks on Haristston is that he needs to develop more play strength and his run support is not the best. But the reason why they like him so much is because of his speed and his ball skills. So as you can see there, he ran a 4.2840, which was the fastest in the draft. Not to mention over his last 20 collegiate games, he had 6 interceptions with 3 of them being returned for touchdowns. So those ball skills match up with that speed. And Beane also said today, I'm thinking this is an Xavier Worthy selection, right? Because my first thought was man, this will be so much nicer to have that 4.28 speed covering Xavier Worthy late in January than Rasul Douglas's 31-year-old legs or Kyer Elam's legs that kept tripping up over each other in the AFC Championship game this past season. But I thought it was pretty interesting because Beane listed some other speedy wide receivers that maybe we're forgetting about because you would like to think that the Bills are going to win the division again. But it's a good point to think that you're playing in the same division as Tyreek Hill, Jalen Waddle, and Garrett Wilson. So I think it's just good to have speed in general. The Bills have been trying to get speed on the back end for years, and they finally accomplished that. Now, speaking of being a little bit undersized, the Bills traded up with Chicago. So I'll give the trade details now before I get into the player here. So they sent Chicago picks 56, 62, and 109 for picks 41, 72, and 240. So they moved up 15 spots to get TJ Sanders. And at first I was like, you gave up a lot to get another player very similar to Ed Oliver. So Sanders is listed at 297, Ed Oliver's 287, and Sanders is primarily a 3-tech. And everyone wanted that big 1-tech, myself included, as you will see coming up here. I was very glad with the 4th round selection. But at first I was a little bit surprised. But the more I learned about TJ Sanders and the more I thought about it, I was like, okay, you know what? I think this is a very good selection here because I think the Bills want to get those defensive tackles who can penetrate those gaps. They say Kansas City is not going to beat us running the ball. Kansas City is going to beat us through Patrick Mahomes. So we have to get that interior pressure. And Sanders is a very explosive interior defensive lineman as he had 10 sacks over the last 2 seasons, as well as 17 tackles for loss. And Beane did say that he sees Sanders playing both the 3-tech and the 1-tech. And I get it because, again, you want that pressure for those passing downs. But I think a lot of us were thinking, okay, but where's that large human being that we've all been coveting? And then it came in the 4th round. So before I get to that, the other reason why I love this Sanders pick is because he coupled it with Landon Jackson. So because Beane was able to get that 3rd round pick back, the Bills drafted Landon Jackson at pick number 72. Now, we learned today that Beane said if they would have stayed put and didn't make that trade with Chicago and they had the 62nd overall pick, Landon Jackson would have been the selection. So he was very high on their board. So the fact that they were able to trade up in the 2nd round, get their defensive tackle, trade back in the sense of getting their 3rd round pick back, and they still got the defensive end that they were coveting, I think that is some very good general managing by Brandon Beane. So as we look at Landon Jackson's numbers here, another high RAS guy. And if you don't know, RAS is relative athletic score. So this guy is just very explosive. He has that great size, great length, long arms, and you can tell that this is what the Bills wanted in their defensive lineman. And Beane said today, we want to be bigger, stronger, and more powerful because we're going to be playing meaningful games in December and January. And basically he was saying we don't want to get pushed around. So I think Landon Jackson is a very intriguing prospect. Honestly, this is probably my favorite draft pick considering the value that they got at pick number 72. And this is one of the scouting reports that I read is from NFL Draft Buzz. Devastating length and power at the point of attack, consistently drives back tight ends and creates immediate displacement against a run, shows advanced hand technique and pass rush, throws a nasty cross chop move and knows how to set up his counters. Excellent edge setter who plays with natural leverage despite his height, anchors and redirects pulling guards with ease. And he has a high football IQ, which shows up in run fits. And he also has a relentless motor. So I think that is huge because if you see one of the comments down there on this tweet from Kent Lee Platty, who is the founder of RAS, he said, so why the low sack numbers? Because over his 4-year career, Jackson only has 16 total sacks. Now, the best answer that I can come up with based on what I've read and what I've seen is that he just needs to clean up his technique. So I think this is a perfect situation because let's not forget the Bills signed Joey Bosa. They signed Michael Hoyt. They extended Greg Rousseau. They still have AJ Epinesa. They drafted Javon Solomon last year. So I think that really this could be AJ Epinesa's replacement down the road, and they don't have to rush into anything too soon. Now, as we go to the 4th round selection here, this is where I did a 180, where at first I was very upset because the Raiders took my guy Dante Thornton Jr. at pick 108. Now, this was a guy who was 6'5", 205 pounds, had a very good RAS score, ran a 4.340, led the nation with 25.4 yards per catch, And I was like, man, the Bills just missed him. But then they traded up to get my other guy, Dion Walker, at 109. So if you remember, they sent Chicago 109 on Friday, and then they got 109 back by sending them 132 and 169, which was one of their 3 fifth-round picks. So they traded up for Dion Walker. I know he could be a little bit polarizing. People were saying that he doesn't have the best technique either. His numbers were low this past season, but he even admitted that he's been playing through a back injury and he could barely stand or walk the right way. So now he's back to feeling healthy, and this is a guy that is that one tech of the future. So we no longer have to cycle through signing these veterans off the street like Jordan Phillips, Quentin Jefferson, Linval Joseph. The list goes on and on. They finally have their one tech that they can develop behind Daquan Jones this year. And I think it is just such a welcome sight as Walker has these elite traits to go with his elite size. And he's listed at 331, but he slimmed down during the season. He was 345. So his weight can kind of fluctuate based on what the Bills want. And Beane actually said today that they had a first-round grade on him back in the fall. So when college football season started, he was on their radar as a first-round grade. But because of those back issues, he slipped on a lot of people's boards, obviously. So Beane said today, and Gaine and Gray, they all agreed the value was too good to pass up on. They had to trade up and go get their guy. So I guess we'll do a 2-for-1 here based on the 2 defensive backs that the Bills selected. And really, we can talk about the third as well because the Bills made 3 selections within 7 picks. So they had picks 170, 173, and 177. So 177 was the first pick of the 6th round, and that's where they took cornerback Dorian Strong. At 170, that's where they selected Jordan Hancock, and I think the best way to list him is just as a defensive back because as you can see here, over his last 2 years as a starter at Ohio State, now this comes from PFF, he had 820 snaps from the slot, 248 as a deep safety, 164 from the box, and 96 at corner. So at first, I think a lot of people were thinking that the Bills triple dipped at corner, and that might be true to some point, but Beane said between Saturday and Sunday that they view him as a safety and a backup nickel. So I think that Cam Lewis was put on notice here. So as you can tell, we have a trend of a lot of players being put on notice between Dwayne Carter, AJ Epinesa, Cam Lewis. You know, maybe this is a good time to talk about that third pick that was sandwiched in there. Jackson Hawes is a blocking tight end. I wasn't the biggest fan of this, but I understand he's probably Quentin Morris's replacement. He probably bumps up the depth chart on Zach Davidson because we know how the Bills want to run the ball. So maybe you even want to go as far as saying that Dawson Knox needs to be put on notice because maybe this could be a younger, cheaper blocking tight end. Now, just to finish out with Dorian Strong here, I really like the value that the Bills got again with the first pick at the 6th round because he was projected to be a round 4 or 5 corner. So the fact that he was able to fall back to round 6, I think you could look at that as another steal. Now, this is a guy who's described as a long, instinctive corner. He can play both zone and man, but he said at his press conference that he prefers to be a press man corner. And some of the scouting reports that I read on him, he can be both sticky and smooth at the same time. And I think that's what the Bills wanted with that value coming from the backup boundary corner. And as for his height and weight, he's 6'1", so good length right there, long arms, but he's only 185 pounds, kind of similar to Haristston here. But he said at his press conference that his dad is a competitive bodybuilder, so you'd like to think that he can bulk up if need be. So, I mean, the Bills really, speaking of bulking up, they bulked up for their defensive backfield because they knew that that was another problem that was hampering them as well. Now, in terms of the Bills' last 2 selections, I think this was just them saying we're going to take the best player available based on our board, and I'll pull up their profiles here so you can read them while I give my analysis. So with Chase Lunt, I mean, that size is very, very intriguing. We know that the Bills love to draft their round 6 and 7 offensive tackles because that pretty much aligns with what I said the 3 guys on the panel said today. You can never have enough offensive tackles. So Lunt went to UConn. Ryan Vandermark also went to UConn. So in terms of the competition and players being put on notice, maybe you could say that Vandermark was put on notice with this selection because he has great size and great pass protection skills as well. And then with the last one here, Caden Prather, this wasn't a wide receiver on my board. To be honest, I didn't even know him before the Bills selected him. So just going based on what the Bills said, he hauled in 98 passes for 1,290 yards and 9 touchdowns over his last 2 seasons at Maryland. prior to Maryland, he spent 2 seasons at West Virginia, and I think this is a guy who can help out with special teams. And I forgot to mention with Dorian Strong that he can also help out with special teams. So as you can see, I think the Bills filled a lot of holes. I think they wanted to be more balanced in terms of winning up front on the trenches. They wanted to get that blocking tight end. They wanted to get players who can contribute to special teams. Again, I just wish that they would have done a little bit more to the wide receiver room, and I wish that they could have had Shawn Dolac. But overall, another very, very solid draft for Brandon Beane and his staff. And it's important to note that we should flip our attention back to free agency, because this is a time where Brandon Beane will often look at his draft class and say, maybe I didn't do enough at a certain position. Maybe I didn't build my wide receiver room up enough. So maybe I need to go back to the free agent class and see what's out there. Maybe I should call Amari Cooper and see if we can re-sign him to a team-friendly deal. I know people have been talking about Keenan Allen. So we'll just have to see what the price tags are, what the market value is, how much salary cap the Bills have left. And then that is when Brandon Beane will try to make the best deal to round out his roster. And aside from free agency, we will have some other things going on here between voluntary offseason workouts. Rookie minicamp will be on the horizon. The NFL schedule release happens in a couple of weeks. So even though we will start to wind down here and we will hit the slow part of the offseason, there's always something to talk about. So that being said, make sure you subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. Smash that like button, drop a comment, let me know what you think about the 2025 draft class for the Bills. Thank you for watching. Thank you for keeping up to date with my offseason coverage here, and go Bills.